Okay, let's go ahead and get started this afternoon. One thing to note is that the first primary source essay is due 2 weeks from tomorrow. So 2 weeks from tomorrow, so that's September 9th. Again, that's 2 weeks off, so I'm not saying rush out and do it tonight, but again, keep that in mind, don't forget about that. The guidelines are available on Blackboard, including the link to what you need to read for the assignment. It's a couple paragraphs from Justin Martyr's First Apology. We'll talk about Justin here in a couple of classes. So take a look at that. If you have any questions about what I'm looking for, what to expect, please let me know. I want to make sure that you have a good idea of what I'm looking for if the description isn't clear enough. Also, remember, you'll have the chance to submit 6. Only 5 of them are necessary for the full credit, right? So if you want to skip this first one, you can skip it. If you, however, would like some points, extra points at the end of the semester, I'd say do it, right? That way you can make sure to do all 6. Or the other thing would be do this one and then skip the one at the end. Right? So, well, however you want to approach it is up to you. But I would say, keep in mind that those are coming, and they're going to be about every 2 weeks. The first 2 are up. I'm working on the readings for the rest, trying to decide who I want you to read. But hopefully, there'll be some interesting readings. Not only do I want you to kind of summarize and talk about what they said, I also want you to spend some time talking about what kind of lessons can we learn from these things. Is there something important here that maybe we need to be aware of? So be thinking about that part too.
You want us to write up on a Word document and then upload it, or write it right in here?
Either way is fine. It needs to be 500 words, so maybe writing in a Word document or something would be easier, so you can make sure, all right, do I have enough words? But by all means, whatever's going to be easier for you. Sometimes if you go through the iPad with Blackboard, it doesn't always take the file attachments very well, so you might have to copy and paste or do it at a computer.
There's no specific format or anything?
No specific format. Yeah. Any other questions about the
just turn it into you, or do I have to go through that?
I prefer the electronic copy, so just send me a file or copy and paste or whatever. Any other questions? All right, so don't forget the first one of those is due 2 weeks from tomorrow. We're picking up now, still looking at our examination of the backgrounds of Christianity and thinking about what's the world like that Christianity develops in. We're shifting our attention today to thinking about what are some of the major teachings or doctrine that we can think about during this time, maybe see some places where there's some similarities to what we'll see in Christianity, as well as some differences, but then also some practices, the same kind of thing. And again, paying attention to those major 3 cultures, Greek, Roman, and Jewish. Now, it would probably seem pretty obvious, if you've done any sort of biblical study at all, that there would certainly be some similarity between Jewish teachings and early Christianity. While there are a lot of places where Christianity will be different, it is that it's out of the milieu of Judaism that Christianity develops. But it's also important to see that as Judaism is in the first century, we're talking about what might best be understood as Second Temple Judaism. Second Temple Judaism, there's some continuity with the First Temple, but there's some differences as well. And we talked a little bit about some of the important things related to the politics and the culture on Tuesday. But as we think about some of the doctrines or teachings of Judaism, there are some important things that had changed in Judaism after it had gone into exile. There are some things that become clearer or more focused than perhaps what had existed in the Israelite religion prior to the exile. One thing that's emphasized more frequently by the prophets, especially, and then in the intertestamental literature and elsewhere, is the focus on an individual's responsibility and righteousness. But when you read through 1st and 2nd Kings, a lot of connection is made between the people and the king. And as the king went, so went the people. And so the focus is on a lot of corporate, either righteousness or sinfulness. But starting with Ezekiel and moving on through there, you see the prophets talking much more about the individual and the individual's responsibility for being righteous. The soul that sins, it will die. Ezekiel says in Ezekiel 18, verse 20. Right? So the idea is on the individual. Now, has God always focused on the individual? Have individuals always been accountable to God? Yes. But the focus becomes much more in the prophetic word, and then, as we see in the New Testament, kind of coming out of it. Another important theme for Jews in the Second Temple period is their focus on the law as being a guide to living. I mean, when you think of the law of Moses and the focus of the law of Moses, a lot of the attention is on ritual, right? Sacrifices. There is some information on how one should lead one's life, right? The Ten Commandments. But a lot of the law is focused on, if this situation arises, this is how you handle it, right? That kind of traditional way we think about law. Well, beginning in that exilic and into the Second Temple period, it became more and more for Jews about a guide to living one's life, right? And more of a philosophical way of approaching it. And thinking about how do individuals relate to each other, more of an ethical focus than necessarily a legal focus. Also, from the time of the exile on, there's much more of an emphasis on this idea of restoration. It has been prophesied in Isaiah and other prophets prior to the exile, but a lot of the prophetic message after the exile is the hope, the expectation that one day God is going to restore the fortunes of Israel, both the land and the monarchy. Right? There's prophecies about a leader who would be the new David. Now, as Christians, we believe these are kind of talking about Jesus, and I believe that's probably correct. But the Jews, of course, don't necessarily see it this way, but they do see that expectation, that hope, that God is going to change the fortunes of the Jews. Also more common is the fact of worshiping in local areas than at the temple. Good job.
I'm kind of interested in how, when you saw the Davidic restoration passage, even though they didn't believe that Christ was the Messiah, did they see the Messiah figure as a deity?
We're going to get into Messiah here in a little bit, but most of the time not. Usually the term Messiah was a lot more loosely used by Jews. And often there was kind of this, it's a lot clearer for us looking back into it, right? That these things are prophesying Jesus. But for them, there's kind of like God's going to come and deliver his people, but then also, there's this kind of Davidic king that's going to come too. And the connection between the two wasn't always clear in the Jewish mind. And so there are certain passages we can point to say, right, that was the case. The Lord said to my Lord, sit on my right hand. Right? Psalm 110. Right? So what does that all mean? Well, Jesus is talking about this idea of it's promoting the Messiah would be a child of David, but it will also be his master or Lord. So we can see passages looking back that way, but it doesn't seem like that was something that most Jews connected. So the last thing I want to emphasize is this idea of localized worship. And a lot of that is shaped by that exilic period, the period when there is no temple. And so any sort of worship that took place had to take place outside of that centralized location. And so you see more localized worship done in a town or a region, the Jews in the area gathering together for worship. And eventually this would give rise to the synagogues, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And it appears that this localized worship continued even after the temple, the second temple, was rebuilt. We've already talked a little bit when we were talking about culture and society about the different parties or sects within Judaism. So we're not going to spend time now to go through that in any great detail, other than to mention that their views on culture were also connected with religious ideas as well. And so here are these Pharisees. They're looked upon as the interpreters of the law. And these are the people that you go to if you want to understand what the law has to say for your life. And for them, the idea is that the pious, right, those that want to be righteous, must live separately from those who don't follow the law. And so a lot of the teaching, a lot of the doctrine of the Pharisees is wrapped up in the law, which is partly why it's the Judaism that develops after the second temple is destroyed is developed out of the Pharisees, because their focus is so much on the law. Well, the destruction of the temple doesn't destroy the law. Whereas the other group, the Sadducees, of course, are so tied to the temple. And their authority, their power is in the temple. When the temple is destroyed, they have nothing to hold on to as an identity. As far as doctrine goes with the Sadducees, we've talked about, they denied the resurrection, they denied the existence of spirits. One thing we didn't mention, I don't believe, is that the only part of the Bible they considered to be scripture was the Torah, was the books of Moses. So that's another doctrinal teaching. Which, kind of as an aside, you remember when the Sadducees come to Jesus, asking him about, here's this woman who married 7 brothers and they all died. Whose wife is she going to be in the resurrection? Jesus, in his wisdom, quotes from the book of Exodus. Even though there are other books that talk more about the resurrection, he quotes from Exodus, because that's one of the books they considered authoritative. Right? If he quoted from another book, I don't know, Ezekiel talks about resurrection, Daniel talks about resurrection, but these were not things the Sadducees considered to be scripture. Right? So where does Jesus go? Right? To their scripture. Right? And so it's just kind of another interesting little highlight there. The Zealots really not too much about doctrine, but the Essenes, we already talked about the separatist idea. As far as doctrine, they're kind of believing they're living in the last days is kind of a way to think about them doctrinally. Despite these differences, there are a couple of places where Jews have relative agreement during this time period. First is what is referred to as ethical monotheism. Certainly there have been groups that were monotheistic. But ethical monotheism refers to the idea that this one God that you believe in expects you to live in certain ways. And so the ethical monotheism is that has something to do with your day-to-day life. Other monotheisms might not have that connection, right? You worship God, but God doesn't necessarily have any sort of expectations about your day-to-day living. The second thing that they looked forward to was this notion of the end of times and the restoration of good fortune, and the coming Davidic restoration. So these are two areas where they agreed, but where did they disagree? Well, there are essentially 3 areas where the Jews disagreed. First was this issue of the content of Scripture. what is Scripture? Is it just the 5 books of Moses? Is it the rest of what we call the Old Testament? What about these other documents that you start seeing in the intertestamental period, like Tobit, and Judith, and Maccabees? Are they part of Scripture or not? A second area where Jews disagreed had to do with how do you relate to outsiders, Gentiles, pagans, and those that have given up on Judaism. How do those people relate to you? Should they still be part of the community? Should you separate yourself from them? Should you separate yourself fully from them? This is where the Pharisees, the Sadducees, etc. disagreed. And then finally, the nearness and nature of what God would do for Israel. How close is God to Israel? What is He going to do? Is He going to overthrow the Romans? Or is He going to use the Romans to bring about this Davidic kingdom? And so these kind of questions developed.